So in today's video, I actually want to answer the question, is the iPad Air 1 still usable in 2020? Now this tablet came out way back in 2013, and it did ship with the Apple A7 processor. Alongside the Apple A7 processor, this thing did ship with a measly 1 gig of RAM, and then outside of that, it did come with iOS 7 installed right out of the gate. And then outside of that, you can actually update this thing all the way to iOS 12. Unfortunately, after iOS 12, this is not going to be getting any more support from Apple. And yeah, that pretty much does it for the specs and for what software this thing actually runs. So this thing can actually still run iOS 12 at the very moment. Now let's actually take a look at the design of this thing. Fortunate enough, if you still buy an iPad Air 1 in 2020, you are still gonna somewhat still get a modern design from Apple. The reason I say modern design is because a lot of iPads today and for a while now still have this same design, just like this iPad in particular, outside of the iPad Pros. Of course, the iPad Pros are really the only device that doesn't have this design in particular, but it's actually very interesting to me to see that Apple really decided to keep this design for the iPad for quite some time. And this is actually a really good design, and it does actually still feel very premium and very nice to hold in the hand. So at least if you were to buy this tablet in particular, you are going to be getting that modern design that a lot of modern day iPads actually share, like I said, outside of the current iPad Pro. So that's actually very nice. I love the fact it's very thin and light as well. This may not be the thinnest and this may not be the lightest tablet from Apple, but even so, for today's standards, you can see I am holding this in one hand, and it's pretty comfortable, and it's very nice to hold. The nice thing about this as well, it just, like I said, feels really premium and very nice in the hands and things like that. So I am glad there's that. And then let's go ahead and actually talk about the display on this thing. The display on this thing is a 9.7-inch screen, and this is not the greatest looking display out there, but I'm actually pretty surprised by how good this thing has actually stood the test of time. You have to take in consideration always that this thing is a device from 2013. It's actually funny, today Apple still uses the same LCD technology in this iPad that they do with the current day iPads, which is actually interesting. The biggest drawback to this screen in particular, let me go ahead and boot it on, but the biggest thing with this display is going to be the fact that this is one of the few iPads that actually has that air gap in between the screen and the glass of the iPad. So basically what that means is you will be getting a gap inside the actual display, and when you touch things on the actual display, it won't actually feel like you're touching them because you do have that gap in between, like I said, the glass and the screen. How bad is the air gap in between the glass and the screen? Well, I don't think a lot of people are actually going to notice it, and honestly, if I'm being 100% honest, I do think people who even used a modern day iPad that doesn't have the air gap in between the glass and the screen, you still may not even notice it. It's going to depend on a lot of different scenarios. Have you been using one with no air gap in it? How long do you look at it? But overall, I don't think it's going to break the experience, but it does suck that the air gap is in between the screen and the glass on this one, which is kind of unfortunate. That's really the only drawback I really see this iPad actually having when it actually comes to the screen of this device, unfortunately, is that air gap. Outside of that, the resolution is actually really good, and I still think it holds up extremely well today. Of course, you do have to take in consideration this thing came out in 2013, but outside of that, I'm still really surprised that the screen looks as nice as it does. Who would have thought a device from 2013 would look this good when it actually comes to the display? But yes, it actually looks like a display you would actually see on a modern iPad, if I'm being honest here, which is actually a really nice thing. Now, the biggest thing you're probably wondering is how battery life is holding up. Now, of course, the battery life will be different from person to person, at least the longevity, because of course a lot of people use their iPads differently, and a lot of people consume them differently. What I will tell you with this iPad specifically, I will tell you I've been getting pretty good battery. I've been getting, actually, believe it or not, 6 to 7 hours of battery when it comes to battery life on this thing, and the battery is holding up extremely well. Of course, it will depend from iPad Air to iPad Air what the battery life situation is and how good the lifetime of the battery is, but what I'm saying is I'm actually pretty blown away by how good the battery still holds up in this thing. So I guess, I don't know why, I guess batteries are just extremely good from Apple. So that's actually pretty good that I'm getting pretty amazing battery from this iPad Air 1. And now let's, like I said, talk about the actual performance of this thing. Is this thing still usable in 2020 as we speak right now? Well, honestly, if you're going to ask me right away, I'm going to show you some demonstrations on screen, and all I'm going to say is I think 100% this thing is definitely usable in 2020, and I think the experience is actually not as bad as you're actually thinking. It's actually a really good for what it is. Of course, take in consideration this thing came out in 2013, of course, so of course it has aged, and of course it's not going to be flawless. I'm just going to say that right now, so keep your expectations in check, but it still is pretty good for a tablet that came out in 2013. So let me go ahead and bring up the web browser and go to a site. Let's see. Okay, it looks like I'm already on a site here. I'm already on Engadget.com. It's going to take a couple of seconds to load because this doesn't have the newest technology when it comes to like the Wi-Fi or anything like that. But you can see I am scrolling down the page. You can see it does take a couple of seconds to actually load things on the screen when you're actually swiping through it. But just the fact that it's this buttery smooth and things like that is actually pretty mind-blowing right now, because you would think a lot of other devices from maybe 2013 would be a little bit laggier or a little bit choppier or not as smooth when you're actually browsing the internet. But no, you can see that it does. It is pretty smooth when you're actually browsing the internet on this device. Now let me go ahead and back out and let me show you some tabs and things open in the background. I'm going to go ahead and bring up like I guess we'll just do CNN.com for this test. Let me go ahead and bring up CNN.com. The one downside I will have to say to the iPad Air 1 in 2020 is definitely the keyboard. The keyboard can get choppy at times. Sometimes it's not choppy, but then other times it's very choppy. And the experience with the keyboard is absolutely not good at all. I'm just going to have to admit that. A lot of times it's just very unusable or very choppy, to where when you press stuff on the keyboard you do have a pretty long delay, and that's really the biggest drawback to this tablet. I am noticing the keyboard is almost unbearable to use at certain points, but it just depends on when I use it. Sometimes it likes to work and sometimes it likes to go all haywire, and it's really laggy and really choppy for the keyboard. Let's go ahead and bring up CNN.com. You can see I still have the website Engadget on in the background, so we're going to actually see how this loads and how this actually performs when we have another tab open. But no, you can see you can have still multiple tabs open as well with this iPad, and you can see actually it is actually still working very good. I wouldn't say it's flawless, and I wouldn't say it's going to be like an iPad you'd get today, like if you buy like the iPad Pros or any of the current iPads that Apple currently sells. No, but at least for what it is and for as old as this thing is, it's still pretty, I would honestly say, mind-blowing how well this thing is actually holding up. Let's go ahead and do some pinch to zooming, and you can see it's still working extremely well for a tablet this old, and it's actually like I said, pretty mind-blowing. But there it is right there for the actual performance of this thing. It's actually still very good. One thing I am noticing with this iPad is when you actually load applications, you do have to wait a little bit, whereas modern day iPad, you don't have to wait for like a loading screen for a lot of the applications. I'm going to go ahead and load like YouTube. You will see YouTube does have to load up, unfortunately, so it's not actually going to be instant, which is kind of a downside to this tablet. But the good news is it's not that long, but just remember that you will have to wait a little bit for the apps to actually load. It's not going to be instant, but of course this thing is aging pretty bad. And then on top of that, the biggest downside this tablet actually has is the fact that it only has 1 gig of RAM. So that's really the biggest drawback to this thing. I wish it had more gig of RAM, at least 2 gig or 3 gig or something like that, but the 1 gig of RAM is really starting to show its age. For example, if I go ahead and load up Safari, it will have to load up the web page right away. It's not going to keep it in memory because, like I said, it only has 1 gig of RAM, and 1 gig of RAM in 2020 is just not enough RAM. Even for mobile devices, 1 gig just will not fly, and you can definitely see that 1 gig of RAM, it is starting to struggle. So if you're a person that's a big multitasker and switches apps all the time, you will know a lot of times it will have to reload. You can see it is reloading right there, the application, because it can't keep it in memory with that measly 1 gig of RAM, which is kind of unfortunate. So you can see there's only 2 apps open in the background, and it's already starting to struggle. So you can see that's definitely not a good idea. That's definitely not good when this thing is starting to struggle when it only has 1 gig of RAM and everything just practically has to reload. But besides that, the performance of this thing has been very good. I've been actually pretty happy with this thing. And the question is, again, could you use this thing in 2020 and beyond? Is this thing something you should pick up today? Well, honestly, if you ask me, I don't think you should pick this up today specifically because, well, there is a number of different reasons why, and I'm going to explain that in this video. But before then, I guess, I actually want to show you some performance on the actual game, and I actually want to show you a game actually being played on this tablet. So there you can see right there, this is Subway Surfers, and this game actually plays really decent on this iPad. I've had no problems with the Subway Surfers. I guess the only thing bad with playing games on here, games take kind of long to load now, and then on top of that, depending on what game you play, you can actually see some stutter and some lag. Of course, this game isn't the most graphical intense game out there on the App Store, of course, and I honestly wouldn't recommend, if you're thinking about buying this thing, I wouldn't recommend playing any games that are too graphic intensive. You can see right there, it already started to lag, and it's already starting to get jittery because this thing is really showing its age. But if you had to play games on here, you can see games are playable. It's just that you really want to play games, like I said, that are not graphic intensive. So maybe like this game, Subway Surfers, Cut the Rope, Temple Run, just very simple games that don't require too much graphical horsepower, and you should be good to go. And you can see the experience is actually not that bad when you're playing little simple games like this that don't require a lot of horsepower, and it does actually kind of feel like it's still a modern day tablet from Apple, and a tablet that you would actually buy from Apple. So that's actually very impressive that it's actually still playing these games as well as it is. But going back really quickly to the experience with this tablet in particular, why I say you shouldn't buy this tablet in 2020, and the main reason why I wouldn't buy this tablet in 2020 is, first of all, you don't know the condition of the battery, and the battery life, depending on who you buy this from, may be a gamble. Yes, my battery is held up extremely well. This battery still gets, like I told you before, 6 to 7 hours of battery, so it's extremely well. But you are going to be gambling a very big chance because some people may have used the iPad more, and the battery may be in a worse health condition, and you do have to take in consideration this tablet is from 2013. Another reason why you may not want to buy this tablet in 2020 as well is because you don't know the condition of the tablet as well, because you do have to realize all these iPad Air 1s are from 2013, and since they're from 2013, a lot of people may have not taken care of their tablets. You may get it in a very bad condition. The screen may have a lot of scratches, the screen may be messed up, and things like that. So this one is honestly in pretty flawless condition. I'm just going to be 100% honest with you guys. I've checked this multiple times, and yes, it pretty much looks like it came out of the box, to be honest. I guess I just got really lucky with this iPad Air 1. It looks like the person who used this iPad Air 1 really did a fantastic job of taking care of this iPad Air 1. But the biggest reason why I wouldn't buy this iPad Air 1 in 2020 is just the fact that it does run iOS 12, and you are going to be missing a lot of modern day features that iOS 13 are now called iPad OS actually has to bring to the table, which is actually inconvenient. And the main reason why I personally wouldn't use this in 2020 is just the fact that I am a person, when I use my iPads and things like that, I want the convenience of having true multitasking, like split view, or like having a lot of apps open in the background I can switch to constantly. But since this only has 1 gig of RAM, it's just not a good multitasker, and if you need to do a lot of tasks, unfortunately things will just reload, they'll crash and things like that. And this thing can't even do split view because it only has 1 gig of RAM, and that's really the biggest downside to this. And if you buy this in 2020, since it runs iOS 12, unfortunately that means the longevity of this thing is starting to dwindle down, just because, well, people are going to stop supporting this thing. App manufacturers are also going to start not supporting this thing when it comes to apps. Apple will force them to stop supporting this in the long run when it comes to iOS, since it's not running the latest and greatest from Apple. Honestly, could you use this in 2020? Like I said, you could definitely use this in 2020. And I think for a lot of people, yes, I'm actually saying this, I think for a lot of people out there, especially if you're much older or maybe you don't know about technology, I think you could get away with using the iPad Air 1 in 2020, but honestly, I just would not recommend it. And if you had to buy some type of device from Apple that's actually usable today and actually just feels like a little bit more modern and a little bit better off, honestly, I would recommend the iPad Air 2 over this one. It still shares the same design, it still has the same body, but just the fact that it does have iPad OS and it does have iPad OS 13 on the iPad Air 2, I would definitely pull the trigger on the iPad Air 2. And the iPad Air 2 is relatively cheap. It is going to be a little bit more higher, obviously, than this iPad Air 1 if you were to buy it used, but it's not that much more. So I've been checking prices of the iPad Air 1 versus iPad Air 2, and the iPad Air 1 is going for about $100 to maybe $60 depending on where you look for the iPad Air 1. And then for the iPad Air 2, it looks like it's going from about $120 to maybe $160 depending on where you look for the iPad Air 2. But honestly, I would go for the iPad Air 2. And I didn't even mention that the iPad Air 2 is just a tablet that also has a slightly better display because it doesn't have that air gap in between the screen and the glass. And then on top of that, you are actually going to be getting a tablet, believe it or not, that is actually going to be thinner and maybe a little bit lighter than this tablet 100%. But anyway, this is the iPad Air 1 in 2020. Is it still usable? Yes, it's very much still usable, especially if you're doing things like just simple web browsing, watching videos, just doing just normal everyday things. I wouldn't really say it's good for intensive stuff like multitasking or you playing heavy games and things like this. But honestly, this tablet still blows my mind right now in 2020 that it is still very usable. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.